The frozen ruins of war-torn France, a single command shatters the silence. Shoot me now. The German prisoner's eyes hold no fear, only urgency, as she stares down the barrel of Private Daniel Calloway's rifle. What drives someone to beg for death rather than capture? When Daniel opens her backpack, he expects weapons or stolen rations. Instead, his trembling hands discover a blood-stained journal filled with meticulously documented atrocities. Names leap from the pages: German officers, locations of massacres, and American commanders he's been taught to revere. Among them, Colonel McCarthy, the man who personally pinned a medal on Daniel's chest just 3 days earlier. But the true shock comes when Daniel discovers a photograph tucked between the pages. A smiling American nurse holding a small child. His mother, who supposedly died in an enemy bombing 3 years ago. As the pieces begin to align, Daniel faces an impossible choice: protect the heroic image of his country's military leaders, or uncover the dark truth behind his mother's disappearance. A truth so dangerous that men like McCarthy would kill to keep it buried. The cold was not the merciless kind that numbed. It was the piercing sort that heightened every sensation until breathing itself became an exercise in agony. Frost formed with each exhale as Private Daniel Calloway's boots crunched through the rubble of what had once been a French village. Dawn was still hours away, but sleep had become as foreign to him as the destroyed landscape around him. His fingers, raw and chapped, gripped his rifle with practiced tension. 3 weeks on patrol had taught him that silence was never truly empty. It merely concealed threats waiting to emerge. The village ruins whispered with memories of families now scattered or buried beneath the very stones he walked upon. The cloying scent of smoke still lingered, intertwined with something else, something sickly sweet that soldiers learned to recognize but never named aloud. A sudden movement between 2 collapsed walls sent his heart racing. Daniel swung his rifle toward the source, his index finger hovering just above the trigger. "Come out now," he commanded, his voice steadier than the trembling in his chest suggested. What emerged from the shadows was not the enemy soldier he'd anticipated. A woman stumbled forward, her face a landscape of dirt and dried blood, clothes torn and muddied beyond recognition. But it wasn't her disheveled appearance that made Daniel's breath catch. It was the complete absence of fear in her eyes. Where terror should have resided, he found only a strange, unsettling determination. She didn't attempt to flee or plead. Instead, she straightened her back with dignity that seemed incongruous with her ruined surroundings and spoke in accented English that carried the unmistakable cadence of German. "Shoot me now." The silence that followed her request pressed against Daniel's eardrums with physical force. His training had prepared him for resistance, for combat, for capture. But not for this. Not for someone who looked directly into the barrel of his weapon with something akin to hope. "Hands up," he ordered, trying to reclaim control of the situation that had somehow slipped from his grasp the moment she'd spoken. The woman complied without hesitation, but her eyes never left his. There was an urgency in her gaze that disturbed him more than any threat could have, as though death would be not an ending, but a release she craved. "Your papers," Daniel demanded, though he already knew she was German. The accent was unmistakable, a giveaway that would normally justify immediate detention, if not worse. "I have none," she replied, her voice stripped of emotion. "Just shoot me and be done with it." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he lowered his rifle, not from fear, but from confusion. Standard procedure dictated that he search her before transport back to camp. With cautious movements, he approached and gestured toward the small leather satchel slung across her body. "Remove it slowly," he instructed. She complied with mechanical precision, as though performing a ritual she'd rehearsed countless times. When she handed him the worn leather bag, their fingers brushed momentarily. Hers were ice-cold but steady. His were warm yet unsteady. Daniel expected to find weapons, perhaps stolen ration cards, maybe even false identification papers. What his fingers touched instead was something wrapped in cloth. The material was stiff in places, darkened with what he immediately recognized as dried blood. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air crawled up his spine. Carefully, he unwrapped the bundle, revealing a leather-bound journal. Its edges were worn smooth from frequent handling, the once vibrant brown cover now darkened with age and stains. Something about the object felt forbidden, as though it contained knowledge not meant for casual discovery. He flipped it open, more out of instinct than conscious decision. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, rows upon rows of meticulous documentation, dates, locations, names. His eyes caught snippets of descriptions, atrocities detailed with clinical detachment. The German woman watched him intently, measuring his reaction as recognition dawned on his face. These weren't random entries. This was evidence, carefully documented accounts of war crimes. Names jumped from the pages, German officers, locations of massacres, methods of execution. But what made Daniel's heart pound violently against his ribcage was the appearance of American names interspersed among them. Respected names, leaders he'd been taught to revere. He snapped the journal shut, suddenly aware of his ragged breathing. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't attempted to flee while his attention was diverted. Instead, she slowly sank to her knees in the frost-covered rubble, her eyes never leaving his. "Now you understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the whistling wind through the broken buildings. "This is why you must shoot me." Daniel's mind raced with implications. Possessing this journal made her not just a prisoner, but a target. Anyone mentioned within those pages would ensure she never lived to testify. And now, by extension, he too was implicated, merely by having seen its contents. Before he could respond, his eyes caught a familiar name on the page where the journal had fallen open. Colonel James McCarthy, the commanding officer he'd idolized since basic training. The man who'd personally commended him just 3 days prior for valor in combat. The same man whose signature authorized the execution of 27 civilians in a small German town, according to the damning entry before him. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the name that seemed to burn through the page, Colonel James McCarthy. His mind refused to process what his eyes had seen, as if rejecting reality might somehow alter it. The weight of the journal in his hands felt suddenly unbearable, each page saturated with accusations that threatened to drown him. McCarthy, the man who had personally pinned a commendation on Daniel's uniform just 3 days earlier, whose firm handshake and approving nod had filled him with more pride than he'd felt since enlisting. The colonel's reputation was beyond reproach, a tactical genius who minimized American casualties while maximizing enemy losses. A patriot, a hero, a war criminal if the journal was to be believed. Daniel's fingers tightened around the leather binding until his knuckles blanched white. The woman remained motionless on her knees, watching him with unnerving intensity. Her expression held neither fear nor hope, only resignation, as though she'd already accepted whatever fate he might choose for her. This silent acceptance unnerved him more than any pleading could have. "Is this real?" His voice emerged as little more than a whisper, rough with suspicion and fear. "How do I know you haven't fabricated these accounts?" The woman didn't answer. She simply repeated her earlier request, each word delivered with deliberate precision. "Shoot me now, before it is too late." Her insistence crawled under Daniel's skin like shrapnel, painful, foreign, impossible to ignore. Why would anyone condemn themselves so willingly? What person would choose execution over the possibility of survival? The contradiction gnawed at him, raising questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. A distant explosion illuminated the horizon momentarily, casting harsh shadows across the woman's face. In that brief flash, Daniel caught something in her expression. Not fear, but urgency, as though time itself was their enemy. He needed to make a decision. Protocol demanded he bring all prisoners to camp for interrogation, but protocol hadn't accounted for discoveries like this, journals that implicated commanding officers in atrocities indistinguishable from those they were fighting against. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. "You're coming with me." She didn't resist as he bound her wrists with cord from his pack. Her compliance was mechanical, as though her body functioned separately from her mind. Daniel secured the journal inside his jacket, the leather cold against his chest like a harbinger of something terrible to come. As they began the trek back toward the American camp, something caught Daniel's eye, a small photograph peeking from between the journal pages. He paused, extracting it carefully. The image showed a smiling American nurse holding a young child. perhaps 4 or 5 years old. The woman's uniform was crisp, her smile genuine despite the obvious signs of war behind her. A makeshift hospital tent, wounded men on stretchers just visible at the edges of the frame. There was something hauntingly familiar in the nurse's features, the shape of her eyes, the slight dimple in her left cheek. Daniel's heart constricted painfully as recognition dawned. He'd seen this face every day of his childhood, in the small framed photograph his father kept by his bedside. The same photograph Daniel now carried in his own wallet. His mother, Margaret Collins, had been a field nurse who disappeared in the European theater 3 years earlier. Official reports claimed she'd been killed in an enemy bombing of a field hospital, though her body was never recovered. Daniel had enlisted partly to honor her memory, partly to understand the war that had claimed her. And now her image appeared in a journal documenting war crimes, held by a German woman who seemed to welcome death. "Where did you get this?" The question emerged as a demand, sharp with sudden desperation. "How do you have a picture of my mother?" For the first time, something flickered across the woman's stoic features. Surprise, quickly masked but unmistakable. She studied his face with new intensity, as though seeking familiar features. Whatever she saw caused a subtle shift in her posture, a straightening of shoulders, a lifting of chin. Still, she remained silent. The journey back to camp stretched before them like a tightrope, precarious, dangerous, with catastrophe awaiting any misstep. Each crunch of their boots on frozen ground, each labored breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, seemed to echo the drumbeat of Daniel's racing thoughts. The journal pressed against his chest felt both incriminating and revelatory, a Pandora's box he couldn't close now that he'd glimpsed its contents. By the time they reached the perimeter of the camp, dawn had begun to bleed across the horizon. Guards at the checkpoint eyed the prisoner with cursory interest. Just another bedraggled German, nothing to distinguish her from the dozens captured weekly. Daniel signed her in with mechanical precision, his handwriting betraying none of the turmoil churning inside him. "Special prisoner for immediate interrogation," he informed the processing clerk, ensuring she would be held separately from other detainees. The precaution felt necessary, though he couldn't have articulated why. As he escorted her to a makeshift detention cell, once a root cellar beneath a half-demolished farmhouse, Daniel became acutely aware of movement near the command tent. The unmistakable silhouette of Colonel McCarthy emerged, surveying the early morning activity of the camp with the calculated assessment of a man accustomed to authority. Daniel instinctively angled his body to shield the prisoner from view, though the action made little strategic sense. McCarthy's gaze swept across the compound with practiced efficiency until it landed directly on Daniel. Even at this distance, the intensity of the colonel's scrutiny sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. McCarthy raised a hand in what might have been greeting or summons. Before Daniel could respond, the colonel's attention shifted to the satchel visible beneath Daniel's jacket, the precise location where the journal now resided. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as McCarthy began walking toward them with purposeful strides. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide the damning evidence. Instead, he stood rooted, watching the approaching figure with the helpless fascination of prey before a predator. The prisoner must have sensed his tension. Without turning, she whispered words that sent ice through his veins. "Now you understand why I asked you to kill me." The makeshift cell stank of damp earth and despair. 4 walls of crumbling stone, a single overhead bulb that flickered in rhythm with the distant generator, and a wooden bench that seemed designed for discomfort rather than rest. Daniel watched as 2 privates shoved the German woman inside with casual roughness that made his jaw clench. She stumbled but didn't fall, maintaining that eerie dignity that had marked her from the moment of her capture. "Got yourself a pretty one this time, Calloway," Jenkins snickered, his breath visible in the cold air of the cellar. "Shame about all that dirt. Might be worth cleaning her up before McCarthy gets his turn." The others laughed, that hollow, forced sound that soldiers produced when expected to, rather than from genuine amusement. Daniel managed a weak smile that felt like a betrayal. Each chuckle echoed in his ears like an indictment. Had they always sounded this cruel, or was he only noticing now because of what the journal had revealed? The journal. His hand reflexively touched his jacket where it remained hidden, pressed against his racing heart. McCarthy had approached them earlier, but a timely artillery drill had drawn the colonel away before he reached them. A reprieve, not a resolution. "Leave her," Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Colonel's orders. No one talks to her until he says so." A convenient lie, but effective. The mention of McCarthy sent the soldiers scattering, their faces suddenly serious. None would risk crossing the colonel, even for the pleasure of tormenting a prisoner. Daniel watched them leave, their boots scraping against the stone steps, before turning back to the woman. She hadn't moved from where they'd left her, standing in the center of the cell as if waiting. "You need to tell me what this is about," he said quietly, once he was certain they were alone. "The journal, the photograph, my mother. All of it." She regarded him silently, her face illuminated intermittently by the struggling light bulb. Each flicker revealed a new detail. A scar near her temple, partially hidden by matted hair. Eyes that held too much knowledge for their apparent youth. Lips pressed into a line of determination rather than fear. "Your mother was brave," she finally said, her voice low. "Too brave." Daniel stepped closer, the space between them charged with unspoken accusations and questions. "Did you know her?" "I know what she witnessed, what she recorded." The woman nodded toward his jacket. "What she died for." The words landed like physical blows. Daniel had lived with his mother's death for 3 years, had constructed a narrative of heroic sacrifice that sustained him through basic training and deployment. The possibility that her death had been something else, something deliberate, threatened to unravel the very foundations of his purpose here. Before he could respond, the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs crashed open. Colonel McCarthy descended with the controlled precision that characterized his every movement. 2 armed guards flanked him, faces expressionless beneath their helmets. McCarthy's eyes, shrewd and calculating, assessed the room before settling on the prisoner with an intensity that seemed to lower the temperature several degrees. "Private Calloway," McCarthy acknowledged without looking at him. "I understand you're responsible for bringing in this guest." Daniel snapped to attention, muscle memory overriding the turmoil in his mind. "Yes, sir. Found her near the eastern edge of Belleville." "Alone, sir?" McCarthy circled the woman slowly, like a predator assessing its prey. She lifted her chin slightly but otherwise remained motionless, her expression carefully blank. Only the rapid rise and fall of her chest betrayed any hint of emotion. "Interesting," McCarthy murmured. "Most Germans we find are either in uniform or trying desperately to convince us they've never heard of Hitler." He stopped directly before her. "Yet here you are, clearly German, making no attempt to hide it. One might almost think you wanted to be captured." Daniel watched the exchange with mounting tension, acutely aware of the journal concealed against his chest. McCarthy hadn't asked about her possessions yet, a detail too significant to be overlooked by a man known for his meticulous attention to protocol. "Has she been processed correctly, Private?" McCarthy asked suddenly, turning to face Daniel. "All personal belongings cataloged and confiscated." The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Daniel forced himself to meet the colonel's gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. Standard procedure. Nothing of note to report." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but rolled out with surprising ease. McCarthy studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Daniel fought the urge to shift his weight, to touch the journal's outline, to do anything that might betray his deception. "Very well." McCarthy turned back to the prisoner. "Let's begin, shall we? Your name, for the record." The interrogation that followed was methodical, precise, like the man conducting it. Name, rank, purpose for being in Allied territory, contacts, objectives. To each question the woman responded with silence, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond McCarthy's shoulder. Her defiance, quiet but absolute, transformed the small cell into a battlefield of wills. As minutes stretched into an hour, McCarthy's composure began to fray around the edges. A tightening around his eyes, a subtle clenching of jaw muscles, a fractional increase in the force with which he delivered each question. Daniel observed these changes with growing unease, recognizing the signs of McCarthy's legendary temper building beneath the surface. When the colonel finally moved, stepping closer to the woman until they were separated by mere inches, the movement carried such menace that Daniel instinctively tensed. McCarthy's voice dropped to a near whisper, intimate and terrifying. "Perhaps you misunderstand your situation," he said softly. "There are no observers here, no Geneva Convention representatives, no one who would question whatever methods I deem necessary to extract information from an enemy combatant." The woman's response shattered the tense silence with the force of an explosion. "I've already seen what you do when you think no one is watching," she said, each word deliberate and clear. "I've seen what you did to the children." McCarthy reacted as if struck. For a fraction of a second, shock registered on his face. Genuine, unfiltered surprise that transformed his features from controlled authority to something raw and exposed. Then, just as quickly, rage descended. His hand moved with lightning speed, striking the woman across the face with such force that she staggered against the wall. "Colonel!" Daniel stepped forward instinctively, then froze as McCarthy rounded on him. "Outside, Private, now." Each word emerged precisely formed, coated in ice. "You are dismissed." Daniel hesitated, torn between obedience and intervention. The woman had recovered her balance, a trickle of blood running from her split lip. Yet her expression remained unchanged, not defiant exactly, but unbowed, as if physical pain were inconsequential compared to whatever burden she carried. "That's an order, Calloway." Daniel complied, climbing the stairs with leaden feet. The guards closed the door behind him, but remained outside. Small mercy or oversight, he couldn't tell. Either way, it left McCarthy alone with the prisoner. The implications turned Daniel's stomach. He waited, pacing the muddy ground outside the cellar, straining to hear anything beyond the muffled rumble of McCarthy's interrogation. After 20 agonizing minutes, the door opened. McCarthy emerged, his uniform immaculate save for a small spatter of blood on his right cuff. His expression was composed once more, but his eyes held something Daniel had never seen before, a flicker of what looked disturbingly like fear. "Have her fed," McCarthy ordered the guards curtly. "No one speaks to her without my express permission." His gaze found Daniel. "Especially you, Private." Hours later, when darkness had fallen and the camp settled into night routines, Daniel returned to the cellar. The guard was easy enough to dismiss with mentions of McCarthy's orders and the promise of contraband cigarettes. Alone, he descended into the gloom where the woman sat motionless on the bench. "What did you mean?" he demanded without preamble. "About what he did to the children?" She looked up slowly, her face now bearing the marks of McCarthy's interrogation, a swollen eye, dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Despite this, a bitter smile formed on her lips. "It's all written in the journal," she said softly. "Every detail. I just don't know if you have the courage to read it to the end." She paused, studying him with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his very thoughts. "After all, the last entry is about Margaret Collins. Your mother." Daniel's breath caught. With trembling fingers, he withdrew the journal from his jacket. The leather felt heavier now, laden with revelations he both craved and dreaded. He opened it to the final pages, and his heart stopped as he recognized the name written there in the same meticulous hand that had documented countless atrocities. Margaret Collins, his mother. Daniel stared at his mother's name until the letters blurred before his eyes. The world tilted beneath his feet, reality shifting like sand in a storm. He gripped the edge of the bench to steady himself, the rough wood biting into his palm. A distant pain that anchored him to the present, while his mind reeled through the past. Margaret Collins, the woman who had read him bedtime stories about knights and honor, who had bandaged his scraped knees and taught him that courage meant doing what was right, especially when it was difficult. The mother whose absence had left a void that 3 years of grieving hadn't begun to fill. How? The question escaped as barely more than a whisper. "How did you get this? How did you know her?" The prisoner watched him with an unsettling steadiness, her battered face betraying no emotion beyond a weariness that seemed to reach her very bones. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, meant for his ears alone, despite the empty cell. "We met at a refugee camp near Ardennes. Your mother was treating children, German children, French children. It made no difference to her. She cared only that they were suffering. A ghost of something that might have been admiration flickered across her face. I was a translator. We worked together for 7 weeks. Daniel tried to process this information, to reconcile it with what little he'd been told about his mother's final posting. The official letter had mentioned only a field hospital, casualties from enemy fire. Nothing about refugee camps or German civilians. The journal was hers, the woman continued. She documented everything she witnessed, not just medical cases, though there were many, but other things. Things she wasn't meant to see. What things? Daniel demanded, his voice sharper than intended. The woman glanced toward the cellar door before answering, her words measured and precise. Experiments, negotiations, executions. Your mother had a habit of being in places she wasn't supposed to be, of seeing things powerful men wish to keep hidden. Daniel opened the journal with trembling hands, flipping through pages filled with his mother's familiar handwriting. He'd grown up seeing that same precise script on shopping lists and birthday cards. Now it documented atrocities with clinical detachment. Dates, locations, names of perpetrators and victims. Some passages were in code, others painfully explicit. Near the middle, a section chronicled medical procedures performed on unwilling subjects. The descriptions were methodical, the outrage contained between the lines rather than explicitly stated. As he read, Daniel's stomach churned. These weren't just Nazi experiments. There were American doctors named, procedures sanctioned by Allied officers, research done in the name of advancing medicine, of gaining advantages over the enemy, of preparation for the next war, even as this one still raged. And among the names of those who authorized these horrors, repeatedly, Colonel James McCarthy. My mother, Daniel faltered, unable to complete the thought, was not involved in their work, the prisoner said firmly. She discovered it, documented it, planned to expose it when she returned home, but she never made it home. The words hung in the damp air between them, heavy with implication. The woman's silence was confirmation enough. Daniel closed the journal, unable to bear more revelations. His world had already fractured beyond recognition. The foundations of everything he believed, about the war, about his country's moral standing, about his own purpose here, crumbling beneath the weight of his mother's words. A terrible suspicion took root in his mind, sprouting tendrils that reached toward a conclusion he couldn't yet face. This journal, is it why she died? The prisoner met his gaze directly. She entrusted it to me the night before she disappeared. Said if anything happened to her, I should find a way to get it to her son in America. A bitter smile touched her lips. Fate has a strange sense of humor, bringing you here instead. Why didn't you just destroy it? Daniel asked, his voice raw. Why keep something so dangerous? Your mother believed the truth mattered, that justice required evidence. She studied him with uncomfortable intensity. She said her son would understand that. Was she wrong? The question struck Daniel like a physical blow. What would his mother expect of him now? To expose these crimes and tarnish the image of American heroism she had raised him to believe in? To protect her memory by hiding evidence that might label her a traitor? The responsibility felt crushing, impossible to bear. His thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of boots on the stairs. Without thinking, he tucked the journal back inside his jacket and stepped away from the prisoner, assuming a posture of casual interrogation just as the door swung open. Private Calloway. McCarthy's voice filled the small space with cold authority. I believe I was clear about unauthorized contact with the prisoner. Daniel snapped to attention, heart hammering against the incriminating evidence pressed to his chest. Yes, sir. I was attempting to extract additional information, sir. Thought a different approach might yield results. McCarthy's gaze moved between Daniel and the prisoner, assessing the situation with the calculating precision that had made him a feared tactician. Whatever he saw, or thought he saw, caused his expression to shift subtly from suspicion to something more predatory. Admirable initiative, Private. The words carried no warmth despite their apparent approval. However, this prisoner requires specialized handling. He gestured toward the door. Report to Captain Reynolds for reassignment. I'll take personal charge of this interrogation from now on. It was a dismissal, one that would separate Daniel from both the prisoner and the information she possessed, from his chance to learn the full truth about his mother. The thought of leaving her alone with McCarthy, knowing what the journal revealed about him, sent cold dread through Daniel's veins. "Sir, with respect, I established initial rapport with the prisoner. My continued involvement might—" "That wasn't a suggestion, Private." McCarthy's tone left no room for argument. "You're dismissed. Immediately." The order hung between them, a test of loyalty and obedience that would define everything that followed. Daniel hesitated a fraction too long before responding. "Yes, sir." As he turned to leave, McCarthy added casually, "And Calloway? Any possessions confiscated from the prisoner should be delivered to my quarters by 0800 tomorrow." Daniel forced his expression to remain neutral despite the icy fear that gripped him. "Of course, sir," though there was nothing of significance, just standard refugee supplies. McCarthy's smile never reached his eyes. "I'll be the judge of what's significant, Private." Outside, in the bitter night air, Daniel's mind raced. McCarthy clearly suspected something, perhaps had known about the journal all along and had been searching for it. If Daniel surrendered it as ordered, any evidence of the atrocities his mother had documented would disappear, along with any chance of understanding what had really happened to her. But if he defied orders and kept the journal hidden, he became a traitor himself. McCarthy would ensure he paid for that betrayal, one way or another. As he walked through the darkened camp, the weight of the journal pressed against his chest like a stone. His mother had believed the truth mattered more than patriotic illusions. She had died for that belief. The question that haunted Daniel now was whether he was prepared to risk the same. The pre-dawn air bit through Daniel's uniform as he paced outside his tent, each exhalation forming ghostly plumes that dissipated into darkness. Sleep had eluded him entirely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's handwriting documenting horrors, or McCarthy's calculating gaze as he demanded the journal. By 0800, barely 2 hours from now, he was expected to surrender evidence that implicated American officers in war crimes. Evidence that might explain his mother's disappearance. Evidence that, once in McCarthy's possession, would surely vanish forever. Daniel had spent the night reading the journal in the privacy of his tent, a flashlight beneath his blanket like a schoolboy with forbidden literature. But what he'd found was far darker than any contraband novel. His mother's entries grew increasingly urgent in the final pages, her normally precise handwriting becoming hurried, almost frantic. She described hearing discussions about cleaning operations that had nothing to do with enemy combatants. Names of villages where civilians had been executed to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Experimental medical procedures performed on refugees who had no way to refuse. And throughout, McCarthy's name appeared with disturbing frequency. When the tent flap snapped open without warning, Daniel nearly jumped out of his skin. His hand instinctively moved to cover the journal hidden beneath his jacket, but he forced it back to his side, assuming a casual posture that felt painfully artificial. McCarthy stood silhouetted against the gray morning light, his imposing figure seeming to fill the entire entrance. He didn't immediately speak, simply studying Daniel with the detached interest of an entomologist examining a particularly curious insect. "Sir," Daniel managed, snapping to attention despite the hammering of his heart. McCarthy stepped inside, letting the canvas fall closed behind him. The small space immediately felt airless, claustrophobic. "At ease, Private." His gaze swept the Spartan interior of the tent before settling back on Daniel. "I expected you in my quarters by now, with the prisoner's effects." Daniel had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his mind, but facing McCarthy directly made every prepared explanation evaporate. He fell back on the simplest deception. "I was just preparing to bring them, sir. As I mentioned, just standard supplies, a canteen, some rations, clothing." McCarthy's smile was a thin, bloodless thing that never touched his eyes. "And you performed a thorough inventory, I presume?" "Yes, sir. Nothing of military value." "I'll be the judge of that." McCarthy extended his hand expectantly. Daniel's throat constricted. This was the moment. Surrender the journal and betray everything his mother had risked her life to document, or defy a direct order and face consequences he could scarcely imagine. He reached slowly into his pack, withdrawing a small bundle wrapped in cloth. This was everything she carried, sir. As you can see, nothing remarkable. He handed over the bundle, his expression carefully neutral despite the acid churning in his stomach. McCarthy unwrapped it methodically, examining each item with meticulous attention. A dented canteen, a frayed hair comb, a packet of stale crackers, a small folding knife that had somehow escaped initial confiscation. His face betrayed nothing, but Daniel recognized the slight tensing around his eyes. Disappointment, frustration, suspicion. This is everything? McCarthy's voice carried an undercurrent of menace. Daniel met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir. Everything of note. The colonel studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a tripwire. Finally, he rewrapped the items and tucked them under his arm. Very well. I'm reassigning you to perimeter patrol, effective immediately. Report to Lieutenant Foster at the Western Checkpoint. Sir? Daniel couldn't hide his surprise. The western perimeter was as far from the detention area as possible while still remaining in camp. I thought my rotation wasn't until... That's an order, Private. McCarthy's tone left no room for discussion. I'm placing Sergeant Miller in charge of prisoner interrogation. Your services are no longer required in that capacity. Daniel recognized the strategy for what it was: isolation, separation from the German woman, containment of whatever information she might have shared with him. He maintained his composure with effort. Understood, sir. McCarthy turned to leave, then paused at the entrance. Without looking back, he added, Oh, and Calloway, if I discover you've withheld anything from me, anything at all, you'll face charges of insubordination at minimum, possibly treason, depending on what's been concealed. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes cold. Just something to consider during your patrol. The threat hung in the air long after McCarthy had gone. Daniel released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hand moving involuntarily to his chest, where the journal remained hidden in an inside pocket he'd hastily sewn into his uniform during the night. The deception had bought him time, but little else. McCarthy clearly suspected something. It was only a matter of time before his suspicions hardened into certainty. Daniel needed to act quickly. But what action could he possibly take that wouldn't end with both him and the German woman facing a firing squad? The thought of her alone in that cell, subjected to McCarthy's specialized interrogation techniques, made his stomach turn. Whatever her role in all this, she had been his mother's confidant, perhaps the last person to see her alive. As he prepared for patrol duty, strapping on his sidearm and gathering extra ammunition, Daniel noticed unusual activity near the command tent. 2 jeeps had arrived, officers he didn't recognize conferring with McCarthy in hushed tones. Their uniforms bore the insignia of military intelligence, a division rarely seen at forward operating bases unless something significant was underway. Moving casually to gain a better vantage point, Daniel overheard fragments of conversation carried on the morning breeze. High Command specifically requested immediate transfer. Sensitive information that could compromise ongoing operations. Secure transport arriving by 1300 hours. McCarthy's response was too low to catch, but his body language spoke volumes: tense shoulders, gestures more abrupt than his usual calculated movements. Whatever these intelligence officers wanted, it wasn't sitting well with the colonel. Daniel continued toward his patrol assignment, mind racing. If they were planning to transfer the prisoner, this might be his only chance to learn what she knew about his mother's fate. Once she disappeared into the labyrinthine custody of military intelligence, he'd never find her again. As he passed near the mess hall, Daniel caught sight of Jenkins and Morales, 2 privates assigned to guard duty at the detention area. They were laughing, passing a flask between them despite the early hour. Swear she hasn't slept at all, Jenkins was saying. Just sits there staring at the wall like she's seeing right through it. Creepy Krauts, Morales agreed, taking another swig. Miller says McCarthy's got special plans for her interrogation this afternoon, after the brass leaves. Jenkins snorted. Won't be much left to transfer after that. Their callous laughter faded as Daniel continued walking, a cold knot forming in his gut. McCarthy intended to conduct his own interrogation before surrendering the prisoner to military intelligence, likely ensuring she'd never reveal what she knew about his activities. About Margaret Collins. By the time Daniel reached the western checkpoint, a plan was forming in his mind. Desperate, reckless, possibly suicidal. But the alternative was allowing his mother's murderer to escape justice, allowing her final act of courage to be erased as thoroughly as she had been. Lieutenant Foster barely glanced up from his clipboard as Daniel reported for duty. Take position at Outpost 3, standard 2-hour rotation. Radio check every 20 minutes. Yes, sir. Daniel saluted and moved toward the designated position, a sandbagged embankment overlooking a war-ravaged stretch of countryside. As he settled in for his watch, he noted that Outpost 3 had clear sight lines to both the main road and a rarely used farm track that wound behind the camp. The journal pressed against his chest like a burning coal, its secrets demanding action. Daniel had until 1300 hours, when the transport arrived, to make his decision. Continue as a loyal soldier, following orders despite knowing the corruption they concealed, or risk everything to uncover the truth about his mother's final days. As soldiers moved about the awakening camp below, Daniel's gaze kept returning to the detention building where the German woman waited. She had carried his mother's journal across war-torn Europe, had somehow found her way to American lines, had practically engineered her own capture, all to fulfill a promise to a dying woman, to deliver the truth to Margaret Collins' son. And now that son had to decide what that truth was worth. The camp erupted into chaos shortly after noon. Daniel heard the commotion before he saw it. Shouts, running feet, the distinctive bark of orders being issued with urgent authority. From his elevated position at Outpost 3, he watched as soldiers converged on the detention area, their movements sharp with purpose and alarm. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His radio crackled to life. All personnel, security breach, prisoner escape in Sector 4, armed and dangerous. Shoot on sight. Repeat, shoot on sight. Daniel's blood ran cold. The German woman. She had somehow escaped, or been taken. Either way, McCarthy would ensure she never reached military intelligence alive. Not with what she knew. Lieutenant Foster's voice cut through the static. Calloway, maintain your position. Watch for movement on the western approach. Yes, sir. Daniel responded automatically, even as his mind raced through possibilities. Had she managed to escape on her own? Unlikely, given the security measures. Had someone helped her? If so, who would risk such an action, and why? The answer, when it came to him, was both obvious and chilling. McCarthy himself. Remove the prisoner before the intelligence officers could question her, eliminate her somewhere beyond the camp perimeter. Report it as an escape attempt gone wrong. Clean, efficient, final, exactly McCarthy's style. Daniel made his decision in that moment, though perhaps it had been made the instant he'd first seen his mother's handwriting in that journal. He waited until Foster moved to consult with another officer, then slipped away from his post, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. The court-martial for abandoning his position would be the least of his worries if his suspicions were correct. Moving through the camp's western edge, he avoided the main search parties, their attention focused on the roads and open fields to the north and east. Daniel headed south instead, toward a thickly wooded area that had once been part of a farmer's woodlot before artillery had thinned its ranks. His instincts told him that if McCarthy wanted to dispose of a prisoner quietly, he'd choose somewhere isolated but accessible, somewhere like those woods. The journal pressed against his chest with each running step, its weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. His mother's final testament, the truth about her death. Justice not just for her, but for countless others whose suffering had been documented in those pages. As Daniel reached the edge of the wooded area, boot prints in the soft mud confirmed his suspicions. 2 sets, one with the distinctive tread of officers' boots, the other smaller, more erratic, as if the person had been dragged or stumbling. Recent tracks, the edges still sharp in the damp earth. He followed them deeper into the trees, moving as silently as his training allowed. The woods muffled the sounds of the camp behind him, creating an illusion of isolation that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. Every sense heightened to painful acuity, the scent of wet vegetation and gunpowder, the The feel of cold air against his face, the sound of his own careful breathing. Then he heard it. Voices. One male, commanding and cold. One female, weaker but defiant. Daniel crept closer, drawing his sidearm with a hand that refused to tremble despite the hammering of his heart. Through a screen of bare branches, he saw them. McCarthy had the German woman on her knees in a small clearing, her hands bound behind her back. The colonel's pistol was aimed at her head with casual precision. They were alone, no witnesses, no record, just an execution waiting to happen. "One last opportunity," McCarthy was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Where is the journal?" The woman's response was quiet but unwavering. "I told you. The American soldier has it. Your subordinate. Calloway." McCarthy spat the name like something foul. "He claimed there was nothing of value among your possessions. Then perhaps he's already read it. Perhaps he already knows what you did." McCarthy's laugh held no humor. "What I did? I protected American interests. I made difficult decisions that weak men couldn't stomach. Everything I did was for the greater good. The children in our den didn't think so." Her voice was steady despite her position. "The civilians in Malmedy didn't either. And neither did Margaret Collins." The name hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that Daniel could feel even from his hidden position. McCarthy's expression darkened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Margaret was naive, sentimental. She didn't understand what was required to win this war. She understood morality, ethics, the very values you claim to be defending. The woman shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at injuries from her previous interrogation. "She had evidence that would have destroyed you. Evidence that died with her," McCarthy said coldly. "As all evidence will." Daniel had heard enough. Stepping from his cover, he leveled his weapon at McCarthy's back. "Lower your gun, Colonel." McCarthy froze but didn't turn immediately. When he did, his expression showed only mild surprise, as if Daniel's appearance was an inconvenience rather than a threat. "Private Calloway, abandoning your post is a serious offense, as is pointing a weapon at a superior officer." "I know what you did." Daniel kept his aim steady, advancing slowly into the clearing. "To those civilians, to my mother." A flicker of genuine emotion, perhaps respect, perhaps simply calculation, crossed McCarthy's face. "Your mother was collateral damage in a much larger conflict than you can comprehend. She was going to expose operations that would have compromised the entire Allied strategy in Europe." "She was going to expose war criminals," Daniel corrected, the words bitter on his tongue. "American war criminals. You." McCarthy's smile was reptilian, devoid of warmth or remorse. "We needed intelligence on German medical research, their advances in battlefield treatment, pain management, exposure therapy. The kind of intelligence that saves American lives." His voice took on a reasonable, almost paternal tone. "Your mother couldn't see the bigger picture. She was going to destroy years of valuable research because of her feminine sensibilities. So you had her killed." The words emerged as a statement, not a question. Saying them aloud made the reality undeniable, final. McCarthy didn't deny it. "I made a strategic decision. One life against potentially thousands of American soldiers who would benefit from what we learned." He gestured dismissively toward the German woman. "Just as I'm doing now." "This woman possesses dangerous information, misinformation really, that could undermine the war effort. Surely you see that national security outweighs personal vendettas?" Daniel advanced another step, keeping his weapon trained on McCarthy's chest. "Drop your gun. You're going to face proper justice. A trial, evidence, witnesses, everything my mother believed in." For a moment, McCarthy seemed to consider his options, his analytical mind visibly calculating odds and outcomes. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lowered his pistol. "You're making a mistake, son," he said, his voice reasonable, almost sympathetic. "Even if you walk us both back to camp at gunpoint, who do you think they'll believe? A decorated colonel with an exemplary record, or a private with a personal grudge?" He shook his head. "The journal is her word against mine, the ravings of a woman who clearly lost perspective. Atir em mim agora." The German woman's voice cut through the tension. She was looking directly at Daniel, her eyes conveying a message he couldn't fully comprehend. "Shoot me now." It's what he wants. Daniel hesitated, confusion momentarily breaking his concentration. It was all the opening McCarthy needed. The colonel moved with surprising speed for his age, bringing his pistol back up in one fluid motion and firing. The report echoed through the trees like thunder, sending birds scattering from branches overhead. Daniel felt the bullet's passage as a rush of displaced air near his ear, followed instantly by the thud of impact behind him. He threw himself sideways as McCarthy fired again, this shot going wide as Daniel rolled behind a fallen log. "You could have had a promising career, Calloway," McCarthy called out, advancing steadily through the clearing. "Instead, you'll be buried in an unmarked grave just like your troublesome mother." The words ignited something primal in Daniel's chest. Rage and grief fused into a singular purpose. As McCarthy moved past the kneeling prisoner, Daniel emerged from cover and fired. Daniel's shot went wide, splintering bark from a tree inches from McCarthy's head. The colonel didn't flinch. His combat instincts were too finely honed for such displays of weakness. Instead, he lunged forward, using the German woman as a shield, his pistol pressed against her temple. "Sloppy, Calloway," McCarthy chided, his voice unnervingly calm. "Your marksmanship instructor would be disappointed." The clearing had transformed into a deadly tableau. McCarthy using the kneeling prisoner as cover, Daniel half concealed behind the fallen log, both men with weapons drawn. Only the German woman seemed oddly at peace, her eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that communicated something beyond their immediate peril. "Lower your weapon, Private," McCarthy ordered. "That's your final chance to salvage something from this unfortunate situation." Daniel's mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. If he surrendered, both he and the prisoner would certainly die out here, their bodies hidden or reported as casualties of an escape attempt. If he fired again, he risked hitting the woman who held the key to his mother's final days. Either way, McCarthy would ensure the journal never reached the proper authorities. The journal. It remained pressed against Daniel's chest, the leather warm from his body heat. McCarthy wanted it destroyed, all evidence of his crimes erased from history, which meant it was the one item of leverage Daniel possessed. "I have what you want," Daniel called out, keeping his pistol steady. "The journal. My mother's complete account of everything she witnessed, everything you did." A flicker of something, not quite fear, but perhaps the closest approximation McCarthy was capable of experiencing, crossed the colonel's face. A fictional account written by a woman who lost perspective on the necessities of warfare. "Let her go," Daniel continued, ignoring McCarthy's dismissal. "Let her go, and I'll give you the journal." "Daniel, no!" The German woman's voice cracked with emotion, the first time he'd heard her express something beyond stoic resignation. "Your mother died to preserve that truth." McCarthy pressed the pistol harder against her temple, silencing her. "An interesting proposal, Private, but how do I know you actually have it? Anyone could claim to possess something they don't have." Slowly, keeping his weapon aimed, Daniel used his free hand to withdraw the journal from inside his jacket. The leather-bound volume seemed to pulse with significance in the filtered forest light, its presence changing the dynamic between them instantly. McCarthy's eyes fixed on it with naked desire. "Toss it over, then we can all walk away from this regrettable situation." "Let her go first," Daniel insisted. A cold smile twisted McCarthy's lips. "You're not in a position to negotiate, son. The journal. Now." Daniel made a show of considering, then nodded slowly. "All right. But I need to know one thing first." He met McCarthy's gaze directly. "Did you kill my mother yourself, or did you have someone else do it?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and accusatory. For a moment, Daniel thought McCarthy might refuse to answer. Then the colonel's expression shifted to something almost contemplative. "Your mother was a liability. She had access to sensitive information due to her medical duties, observed procedures she lacked the context to understand, and planned to expose work that was vital to American interests." McCarthy's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing a routine tactical decision. "I didn't pull the trigger personally. I simply identified a threat and ensured it was neutralized. Nothing personal. purely operational necessity. The casualness with which McCarthy dismissed his mother's murder ignited something molten in Daniel's chest. It took every ounce of his self-control to maintain his outward composure. "The journal," McCarthy prompted, extending his free hand while maintaining his grip on the prisoner with the other. Daniel hesitated, making a decision that would define everything that followed. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tossed the journal. Not to McCarthy, but to the side, where it landed several feet from either of them in the damp forest undergrowth. McCarthy's eyes tracked its arc, his attention momentarily dividing between the journal and his hostage. It was the opening Daniel needed. He lunged forward, firing a shot that deliberately struck the ground near McCarthy's feet, forcing the colonel to instinctively step back. In that split second of distraction, the German woman drove her elbow backward with surprising force, catching McCarthy in the stomach. He stumbled, his grip on her loosening just enough for her to twist away. Daniel closed the distance between them in 3 rapid strides, colliding with McCarthy in a tackle that sent both men crashing to the forest floor. The colonel's pistol discharged, the bullet whining harmlessly into the canopy above. They grappled violently, each fighting for control of their weapons, leaves and dirt flying as they rolled across the clearing. McCarthy fought with the precision of someone who had trained in close combat, each movement calculated for maximum effect. But Daniel had youth and righteous fury on his side, a combination that made him both reckless and formidable. He absorbed a devastating blow to his ribs without faltering, responding with a strike that split McCarthy's lip and sent a spray of blood across both their uniforms. "You're throwing away everything," McCarthy hissed through bloodied teeth, attempting to bring his pistol to bear. "Your career, your life, your country's security, all for a woman who couldn't understand the necessities of war." Daniel managed to slam McCarthy's wrist against a protruding tree root, the impact forcing the colonel to release his weapon. It skittered away across the forest floor, disappearing beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. "My mother understood exactly what war should never become," Daniel growled, landing another blow that rocked McCarthy's head back. "She understood that when we adopt the enemy's methods, we become what we're fighting against." McCarthy's laugh was a wet, ugly sound. Noble sentiments from the comfort of home, meaningless in the field. With unexpected strength, he reversed their positions, pinning Daniel beneath him and wrapping his hands around the younger man's throat. "This is how wars are actually won, son, by men willing to do whatever it takes." Daniel's vision began to darken at the edges as McCarthy's grip tightened, cutting off his air supply with methodical pressure. He clawed desperately at the colonel's arms, his strength fading with each oxygen-deprived second. Then, abruptly, McCarthy's weight disappeared. Daniel gasped, dragging precious air into his burning lungs, blinking to clear his vision. Through the haze, he saw the German woman standing over McCarthy's prone form, a heavy branch clutched in her hands. Her face was spattered with blood, whose Daniel couldn't tell, but her expression remained as composed as ever. "Your mother saved my life," she said quietly, dropping the makeshift weapon. "At the refugee camp. When typhus was spreading and the American doctors wouldn't treat Germans, she smuggled medicine to us. She didn't see uniforms or nationalities, only human suffering." Daniel struggled to his feet, every muscle protesting the movement. McCarthy lay motionless, a gash across his temple leaking blood onto the forest floor. "Is he unconscious?" she confirmed, "but alive." Daniel retrieved his pistol, then McCarthy's, securing both weapons before approaching the colonel's still form. The man who had ordered his mother's death looked strangely diminished now, not the towering figure of authority Daniel had feared and respected, but simply an aging soldier whose moral compromises had transformed him into something monstrous. "We need to get back to camp," Daniel said, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "The military intelligence officers, they need to see the journal." The woman nodded, her eyes moving to where the journal lay partially covered by leaves. "Your mother believed that regardless of nationality, some crimes cannot be excused by warfare. That documentation was her weapon against barbarity." She regarded Daniel with quiet intensity. "She would be proud of your choice." Daniel retrieved the journal, brushing dirt from its cover with a reverence born of understanding its true significance. Not just evidence of crimes, but his mother's final testament, her refusal to be silenced even in death. "What happens now?" the German woman asked, gesturing toward McCarthy's unconscious form. Daniel checked the colonel's pulse, steady despite the head wound, before responding. "Now we make sure the truth is heard, no matter the cost." As if summoned by his words, shouts echoed through the trees. The search parties, closing in on their position. Daniel and the prisoner exchanged a glance of shared understanding. Whatever came next, they had already passed the point of no return. The search party found them before they could formulate a plan. 5 soldiers burst through the undergrowth, rifles raised, expressions shifting from determination to confusion as they surveyed the scene. Colonel McCarthy unconscious on the ground, Private Calloway standing with a pistol in each hand, and the German prisoner unbound beside him. "Drop your weapons, Calloway," Lieutenant Foster barked, his rifle aimed squarely at Daniel's chest. "What the hell is going on here?" Daniel knew how it appeared: insubordination, desertion, possibly even treason. The very accusations McCarthy had threatened him with just hours earlier. Yet, as he stood there, his mother's journal clutched in one hand, the truth felt like the only shield he had left. "The colonel was executing a prisoner without trial," Daniel said, his voice steadier than he expected. "A prisoner who possesses critical information about war crimes committed by American officers." Foster's expression hardened. "Put down your weapons now, or we will open fire." Daniel slowly placed both pistols on the ground, raising his hands in a gesture of compliance. The German woman remained motionless beside him, her face betraying nothing of the turmoil they both surely felt. "He needs medical attention." Daniel nodded toward McCarthy. "But when he wakes up, he has serious questions to answer." 2 soldiers rushed to the colonel's side while the others kept their weapons trained on Daniel and the prisoner. Foster approached cautiously, his gaze flicking between them with undisguised suspicion. "The journal," Daniel continued, holding out the leather-bound volume. "My mother documented everything. Experiments on refugees, civilian executions, deals with Nazi doctors to exchange research. McCarthy was involved in all of it, and when my mother threatened to expose him, he had her killed." Foster's eyes narrowed. "Your mother? What are you talking about, Calloway?" "Margaret Collins. Army nurse, attached to the 345th Medical Battalion. Reported killed in an air raid 3 years ago." Daniel's throat tightened around the words. "But she was murdered to prevent her from revealing what American officers were doing in violation of every code of military conduct." Foster hesitated, his rifle lowering fractionally. Something in Daniel's tone must have registered as genuine, or perhaps it was the specific details that gave him pause. "Collins," Foster repeated. "I remember her. She treated my leg wound at Bastogne. Good woman." McCarthy groaned, beginning to stir under the ministrations of the medic crouched beside him. Daniel felt a surge of urgency. Once the colonel regained consciousness, the narrative would shift irrevocably. "Sir," Daniel addressed Foster directly, "there are military intelligence officers at camp right now. This prisoner was scheduled for transfer to their custody at 1300 hours. McCarthy brought her out here to eliminate her before that could happen, because she knows what's in this journal." The German woman finally spoke, her voice carrying a quiet dignity despite her battered appearance. "I was Margaret Collins' translator at the refugee camp. She documented everything she witnessed, not just German atrocities but Allied ones as well. She believed that evil must be exposed regardless of which uniform it wears." McCarthy's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused at first, then sharpening as he took in the tableau around him. When he spoke, his voice was raw but commanding. "This woman is a German spy. Calloway has been compromised, possibly feeding her information for months. Everything they're saying is designed to sow discord among Allied forces." Foster looked between them, indecision written across his features. Years of deference to McCarthy's authority warred with the conviction in Daniel's voice and the damning evidence of the colonel's unauthorized presence in the woods with a prisoner. "The journal," Daniel insisted, extending it toward Foster. "Read it yourself. My mother's handwriting, her observations, dates, locations, all of it corroborated by witnesses who are still alive." McCarthy struggled to sit up, pushing away the medic's restraining hand. That journal is a fabrication. German propaganda designed to undermine Allied command. I was bringing this prisoner to a secure location for enhanced interrogation when Calloway interfered, clearly demonstrating where his true loyalties lie. The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and calculated. Daniel saw the uncertainty ripple through the other soldiers, their ingrained respect for McCarthy's rank battling with the scene before them. "Sir," the medic said quietly to Foster, "Colonel McCarthy's presence here with the prisoner isn't authorized. There's no record of a transfer order in the daily logs." A flicker of doubt crossed Foster's face. McCarthy saw it too, his expression hardening into something dangerous. "Lieutenant, I don't answer to daily logs. My authority comes directly from division command." McCarthy's tone was precisely calibrated, reasonable, authoritative, the voice of experience addressing inexperience. "This prisoner possesses intelligence vital to ongoing operations. Operations beyond your clearance level." Foster hesitated, years of military hierarchy exerting their powerful influence. Then his gaze fell on the German woman. Specifically, the bruises on her face and the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Evidence of interrogation that went well beyond regulation. "Let me see the journal," Foster said finally, extending his hand toward Daniel. McCarthy's face contorted with rage. "That's an order, Lieutenant. Secure that document as enemy propaganda and arrest this man for desertion and aiding the enemy." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then, with deliberate slowness, Foster took the journal from Daniel's outstretched hand. "Secure the colonel," he ordered the medics. "He needs medical attention back at camp." "You're making a catastrophic mistake," McCarthy snarled as the soldiers helped him to his feet. "Your career is over, Foster." "Maybe so, sir." Foster met the colonel's gaze steadily. "But I'd rather explain why I secured a senior officer for investigation than explain why a prisoner in our custody was executed without trial." As they began the trek back to camp, Daniel found himself walking beside the German woman, both of them under guard, but no longer treated as immediate threats. The journal had passed from his possession to Foster's, its secrets now beyond McCarthy's reach to destroy. "My mother," Daniel said quietly, the question that had haunted him finally finding voice. "How did she die?" "Really?" The woman kept her eyes on the path ahead, her voice low enough that only Daniel could hear. She was bringing evidence to the French resistance. Photographs, documents, her journal. She knew McCarthy had discovered what she was doing, that she'd been marked for elimination. But she believed the truth had to reach the outside world, regardless of the cost. Daniel absorbed this in silence, imagining his mother's final acts of courage, not the passive victim of an enemy bombing as he'd been told, but a woman of conviction who had sacrificed everything for justice. "McCarthy had her ambushed on the road to Reims," the woman continued. "She was shot, but managed to give me the journal before she died, made me promise to find her son if I survived." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "She said you would know what to do with it when the time came." The camp came into view through the trees, its perimeter now crowded with vehicles bearing the insignia of military intelligence. Officers in immaculate uniforms waited near the command tent, their posture suggesting growing impatience. When they caught sight of the returning party, McCarthy supported between two medics, Foster carrying the journal, Daniel and the German woman under guard. Their expressions shifted to alert interest. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, watching as one of the intelligence officers started toward them with purposeful strides. The German woman's gaze remained fixed on the journal in Foster's hands. "Now we discover if your military values truth more than it values protecting its own." McCarthy was watching them from several paces ahead, his eyes burning with hatred and something else, perhaps fear. For the first time, Daniel recognized the colonel's true vulnerability. Not physical, but moral. A man whose power had depended entirely on his crimes remaining hidden. As they reached the edge of camp, the intelligence officer intercepted Foster, his attention immediately drawn to the leather-bound volume in the lieutenant's hands. McCarthy began speaking rapidly, his usual composure fracturing under the weight of desperation. But Foster was already extending the journal to the officer, his decision made. Daniel felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Whatever happened next, court-martial, imprisonment, worse, his mother's voice would finally be heard. The truth she had died for would come to light. In that moment, as the intelligence officer opened the journal and began to read, Daniel understood what his mother had known all along, that sometimes survival mattered less than ensuring that the truth survived, that some principles were worth any sacrifice. The German woman stood silently beside him, her mission complete after years of carrying another woman's testimony across the war-torn continent. Their eyes met briefly, a wordless acknowledgement passing between them. Not allies exactly, not even friends, but companions in a quest for justice that transcended the artificial boundaries of nation and uniform. Justice that, like the truth it served, recognized no flags. The line between heroism and atrocity is often thinner than we care to admit. As Daniel discovered, the uniform someone wears doesn't define their moral character, their actions do. When faced with uncomfortable truths about those we've been taught to admire, do we bury that knowledge to preserve our comforting illusions? Or do we stand firm, regardless of personal cost? What would you have done with Margaret Collins' journal? Sometimes the greatest act of patriotism isn't blind loyalty, but having the courage to hold your country accountable to its highest ideals. Daniel's mother understood that documenting darkness wasn't an act of betrayal, but an act of profound love, for her nation, for humanity, and for the truth itself. In our own lives, we face similar choices, albeit rarely so dramatic. When we witness injustice, do we remain silent for our own comfort, or do we speak, knowing our words may carry consequences? If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to life. Remember that in a world where truth is increasingly precious, those who dare to preserve it, like Margaret Collins, are the true heroes of history, the ones who understand that some principles are worth any sacrifice.